Our kids are old enough now that they each have their own music and their own playlist. We recently combined them so that we would all have something to listen to in the car. We spend a lot of time there. Anyway, when we listen, we usually put the combined playlist in shuffle mode. When you do this, the songs on your list are played randomly. Yet when you stop and start the list, you frequently hear the same songs that you may have heard on the last trip. For this reason, I frequently hear the assertion that the list is not being played randomly. But in fact, it is. True randomness is much clumpier than people tend to think. And the mistakes that we make and our misunderstanding of the true nature of randomness tend to be much more costly than a little more crankiness on a road trip. I don't know if you've checked out Ngram, but it's a very interesting program by Google that looks for words and phrases used in its own words, lots and lots of books. It looks for how often these words and phrases appear in books as one way to determine whether they are becoming more or less popular over time. The graph you're looking at now tracks use of the phrase cancer cluster, which got lots of use in the 80s and 90s, but not so much now. Not so much now because, as it turns out, in the great majority of cases, cancer clusters don't actually exist, at least not in the context originally intended. Ever heard of Erin Brockovich or Love Canal? Two incidents in which cancer in a community was linked to hazardous waste sites nearby. In both cases, despite years trying to debunk the debunkment, it is now very clear there is no link between the cancers in these communities and the nearby hazardous waste sites. This has been the case in the vast majority of similar cases around the world. There are two main reasons why this happened. First, we mistake correlation for causality, especially when we have a stake in proving causality. The now thoroughly disproved connection between autism and vaccinations is a good example of mistaking correlation for causality. Some kids start displaying autism symptoms around the time they get vaccinated. Ergo, there must be a connection. The affliction is devastating to many families, but there is no connection. The timing is coincidental, not causal. Second, we humans have a fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of randomness. If you give someone a sheet of paper and ask them to arrange a series of dots randomly, they will almost always come up with a grid-like pattern where the dots are more or less equidistant from each other. Something like this. But when you have a computer create a true pattern of randomness, such as physicist Richard Muller has done here, you find the patterns are much less regular than we would think, and that events, or in this case stars, arrange themselves in clusters with a fair amount of empty space in between. In the case of cancer clusters, on average, about 1 in 4 of us will get cancer at some point in our lifetimes. It's inevitable that, independent of any other factors, cases of cancer will not be equally spread across the country, but will instead be observed in clusters. If one starts with the clusters and then begins looking about for a hazardous waste site nearby, it is also inevitable that one will begin to see causality where in fact none exists. This phenomenon is explained in detail in a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. He also explains why a misunderstanding of randomness causes people to, for example, mistake what appears to be a hot hand in gambling or professional sports for something other than what it is: random chance. Since it's illogical to assume that sports are exempt from the rules of randomness, it is inevitable that some players will exceed expectations for brief periods of time while others slump. Obviously, streaks and slumps are real, but attributing this to, for example, being a clutch player or a choker unfairly and inaccurately lionizes some and stigmatizes others. More serious consequences occurred when the British, for example, observed clusters of bombing strikes by the Nazis during World War II and inferred the results were due to spy infiltration. Too late. They discovered that these strikes were actually due to clumpy randomness. Now, this error cost precious time and resources. I'm sure you'll be stunned to hear me make a connection between our misunderstanding of randomness and the choices we often make to limit human freedom. Cancer clusters? Well, spend billions of other people's money on cleanups. Drought in the West? Well, shut down the coal mines in West Virginia. Flood in the East? Well, climate is changing. Build more wind farms with other people's money. I'll let you in on a little secret. When we stop having floods and droughts, that will be the time to worry. Floods and droughts are embedded in the very nature of our climate and are absolutely inevitable due to random atmospheric conditions. If they stop happening, something is seriously wrong. Now, COVID-19 took these kinds of errors to a whole new level, imposing enormous costs on society based on observations of correlation, with hardly a glance at causality. If I could identify one factor that has imposed the highest cost on our society, this may very well be it. Unfortunately, I see no signs of us correcting or even recognizing this error. It provides a very convenient way to inject politics into science. And Lord knows, we're always looking for a good excuse to do that.